Okay, this is gonna get a little weird because I've just been recording for like 15 minutes and realized it never turned on. So it's gonna be a little bit like a PowerPoint. In this case, the cartoon says, "Welcome to Science Hell, Professor. This is Tony. He once saw something on the internet about your field of expertise and is going to spend eternity lecturing you on it." This is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people get a little bit of knowledge about something, feel like they really know how it works, and that the rest of the world who are experts don't understand it. And so they're telling, biologists how biology works. And, and we all are prone to it. I still am not a complete believer in dark matter, even though I don't have the physics and cosmology background to really judge it. It's just I can't get it to make sense to me. So, I feel like, it's like ether, when people used to think that you needed ether between planets for light to travel through. There's something about dark matter where I think that there's something else going on other than this great invisible thing that nobody can detect other than by watching gravity effects. And I'm much more inclined to go, well, maybe gravity at great distances doesn't work the way you think it does. But the physicists say, no, that's not what's going on. But my Dunning-Kruger little brain goes, I don't believe you. I don't know you're really the expert on it that I am when I don't really know anything about it. So this is going to be a little bit like a PowerPoint because I've already written this stuff down and talked about it. Now I'm going to walk over and make sure it's actually recording, which it is. We're going to talk about disease evolution. And by disease evolution, we're talking about disease organisms, things that live in a larger host and interact with some way that produces symptoms, produces disease. And in that case, the host is their ecosystem, is that the world is just a barrier to get from one host to another, is that they don't really, well, a lot of them don't really live in the world, they just use it to get from one host to the next host. Once they're in the host becomes their world. And that's where a lot of the interactions come from. A new disease has come into a host from another type of host. They think the coronavirus originated in bats, possibly went through pangolins, although they don't think that anymore, to get to humans. And as an ecosystem, there's some trickiness to this. We talked about growing microbes on nutrient media, that different microbes require different mixtures of nutrients. Well, as an ecosystem, that's what the host becomes. He becomes a source of nutrients. And so they need to access and mobilize resources. And that is dependent on where they can get to, where they can stay, what sort of resources are available there. And it isn't always that straightforward. Hookworms. Hookworms, they live in your intestines, which is tricky in and of itself. To get into that part of the ecosystem, you need to get through a big bag of stomach acid. There's a reason why there are very few intestinal viruses, things that cause intestinal symptoms in people. When somebody says you have a stomach flu, you don't. There's no such thing as a stomach flu. There's a couple of viruses that can get into your intestines and mess them up. But most of the time, if you have an intestinal issue, you either have a toxin or a bacterial invader that's causing the problem. You don't have a virus because the virus casings can't get through stomach acid. Stomach acid is specifically there to make big biological molecules go bleh and unwind so that you can start to snip them apart to digest them. And bacteria can go through because they have spore casings. A lot of worm parasites can get their eggs through because the eggs have these resistant casings. Protozoa have resistant casings. We'll talk about those later. But I'm going to use hookworms as an example here. Hookworms are a weird intestinal parasite. They can get into your intestines, but unlike most other things that can live in your intestines, can resist being digested there, they don't take advantage of the fact that they're in a big bag of digesting food. Tapeworms are doing that. Most other things that live in your intestines are using your food for them. Hookworms bite into the lining of your intestines and suck your blood out. there's a very good chance that the hookworms are descended from lung worms, and they needed to get the eggs out of the body, so they kind of, it was easier to relocate to the intestines. They could still bite the lining and suck blood the way they were doing it in the lungs. They do actually emerge in your lungs and move to your intestines when they invade the body. But anyway, there's not a lot of food in blood. There are nutrients in your blood, but it's very, very dilute. And so they will pump a lot of blood. If you get a bunch of hookworms, which you can do, very dangerous, they can make you anemic. They can lose so much of your blood into your intestinal system that you can't keep up with it making more blood. So sometimes the symptoms associated with diseases are what they do to your resources. They can deplete certain resources for themselves and produce an effect that way. In some cases, they have their own metabolism they're doing with the resources, and in some cases they produce and release chemicals that themselves can be poisonous to you. If you have a tetanus infection, tetanus bacteria are anaerobic bacteria. They do not get along well with oxygen. They are not terribly active in the presence of much oxygen. And they live deep in the soil where there's not a lot of oxygen, but they spread through spores, and the spores settle on things. And if you get a puncture wound in a somewhat thick part of your skin, like stepping on something especially, there are layers of your skin that are quite a ways from the air and quite a ways from your blood. And so you'll get these middle layers where there's very little oxygen. The cells are dying and flaking off anyway, so a lot of your skin is dead cells, so oxygen level's not a big deal for your skin cells. But you can get a layer where the tetanus bacteria can live. They get enough resources that they get what they want, but one of their metabolites will get into your tissue fluid, get carried into your blood, and mess up your muscle chemistry, make your muscles lock up. That's why they call tetanus lockjaw, because one of the early symptoms is your jaw muscles lock up and you can't move your jaw effectively. And it can eventually paralyze your breathing muscles and kill you. It's pretty bad. But what you're dealing with is the bacterial's metabolites circulating in your system. Chemicals they're giving off can produce symptoms, as well as the stealing of your own resources can produce symptoms. In some cases, they can interact with other things, is that they can set off an immune system reaction. They can damage tissues, as if you get a Chinese liver fluke, well, you got to get a bunch of them. But that's also possible if you get the wrong contaminated sushi. You get a bunch of liver flukes chowing down literally on your liver cells. And that interaction can deplete your liver cells. So your liver is a huge toxin treatment system and chemical processor from your digestive system. And you do not want that depleted. People with cirrhosis or liver cancer, it's a big, big, big problem. If you take way too much Tylenol and kill a bunch of your liver cells, that's a big, big problem. It will kill you. So there's a number of interactions between the invaders and the invadee, the host, that can produce the symptoms as well. Your immune system will recognize invaders and try to respond to them. And one of the common responses is inflammation. Inflammation can, it expands blood vessels so that your white blood cells can kind of converge on the scene. You leak fluid, more red blood cells go through the blood vessels that are leaky, but they don't leak out. But it does redden and warm the area. So those are your typical symptoms of inflammation. But the inflammation is an immune response to a perceived invasion. So you get a cut and it reddens and swells up. Sometimes you can damage internally and release certain chemicals from damaged cells, and your immune system reacts to that too. So if like you twist your ankle, and I just when I coach people and they twist their ankle and they go, oh, is it really bad? I go, well, let's wait a couple of minutes. Because if you have damaged it, the chemicals from the damage will cause a local inflammation. But that's not an invasion, but it's still a response your body has to problems, to what it perceives. In that case, you're releasing a lot of chemicals from damaged cells, and your body goes, well, maybe something's coming in, and they send an inflammation there to kind of respond to it. Now, the inflammation and a number of other things are early responses. We've got a bunch of kind of generic antibacterial responses, antiviral responses that are kind of programmed into us, that kind of try to keep something from killing us before very long, from doing damage that could possibly really damage us or kill us. In the case of COVID-19, one of our early responses is we recognize invading viruses, we recognize the changes that happen in viral infected cells, and we throw a chemical at them to try to block their activity. And it's called interferon or interleukin. I'm now drawing a blank. I think it's interferon. But interestingly enough, COVID-19, very quickly, the cells that it's infecting are releasing a chemical that says to the system that makes this interferon, nah, we're fine, don't make any interferon, nothing to see here, leave us alone. And it allows the virus to rapidly grow and move amongst your cells without a lot of stuff in the way. They do think that if you've been exposed to another viral infection recently before you get exposed to COVID, or you've had a vaccine, which also releases interferon into the system, that may be a partial protection from that first wave of viral infection you get with COVID. And it may be why some people are, very few symptoms are asymptomatic, because the virus can't really get a foothold with the interferon that's already in play when they get there. It gets very complicated beyond that. That's a simplification of it. But if you've had a vaccine, I do believe the reason that my COVID was very mild was I'd had the flu vaccine not that far before. And so I had interferons in play when I got exposed. Now, one of the weirder things about our early reactions, and I'm just gonna do this so it'll stay on there. We have a bunch of bacteria that are our friends, that live in us. We give them something, they give us something back. We have a bunch of bacteria that are what are called commensals. They live in us. They don't really do anything bad to us. They don't really take anything from us particularly. We give them a place to live. They're happy. There's no real trade-off. Symbionts, there's a trade-off. It's a relationship between organisms where they both benefit somehow. In the case of a lot of our microbiome bacteria that live in our colon, we give them a nice low oxygen place to live with nutrition for them, and a certain number of bacterial species will migrate up to just where your immune system cells are, right in the lining, and basically give them a boot camp in how to fight other bacteria, and sometimes viruses as well. And we depend on that to be able to do some of this early defense work, is if your microbiome isn't working well, then you may be more prone to infections. Also, if it's not working well, you may be more prone to your immune system getting confused and attacking your own cells, to not being sure what to attack and what not to attack. So your early response is pretty important, because that's what keeps most diseases from killing you quickly. You go, well, we make antibodies. Well, yeah, we make antibodies, but antibodies are latecomers. What happens when you get an invasion? Well, even if it's not an invasion, if something new to your system that doesn't belong there comes in, your immune system just goes, okay, well, here's a molecule that doesn't belong to us. And it literally will tear it off the surface of whatever this thing is. It might be a dangerous invader. It might just be something benign. You don't wait to find out. Rips the molecule off, hands the molecule oriented the right way to a cell that will then go into your genetic bag of tricks. It's a very, very neat trick. And it will make an antibody that will actually lock onto that. And when it's locked onto that, the other end of the antibody molecule activates basically a flag that basically says to your immune system cells, you see this? whatever's attached over here, deal with it. And some of your immune system cells will come in and gobble it up and digest it. Some of them will pump oxygen radicals at it and poison it. There's a whole bunch of different ways your immune system cells will deal with whatever that thing is attached to. If it's attached to your own cells, yeah, that's bad too. Autoimmune diseases. But it takes you a while to make antibodies. It's variant in people. It often takes at least a week or two, sometimes several weeks. So typically, by the time you've made the antibodies, you better hope your early system has gotten control of the situation. In COVID, you're making antibodies toward the end of the experience, but not enough for people that get a serious set of symptoms and wind up being hospitalized. They're not making enough antibodies to really affect it. And the idea of giving them plasma from people who do have antibodies to help fight it apparently isn't doing, even those antibodies are not at a high enough level because of the viral load that they're going up against. So you better have fought it off, or the antibodies are not going to be in time. Now, while I'm talking about COVID and antibodies, some studies came out like a month or two ago. They looked at people that had gotten over COVID and they checked them like 6 months later. So people from early, the early wave in like February in China and stuff. And they found their antibody levels were low compared to the levels you get when people are actually, in the throes of COVID. And they went, well, your antibody levels are dropping. I don't know if you're going to stay immune. Once you develop antibodies, maybe they're. But the thing is, if you're actively fighting something, your antibody levels are going to be elevated. If you've cleared it from your system, your antibody levels drop to a low kind of baseline level. You're ready to fight it again if it invades. You've got enough antibodies to react to the first wave, activate cells to make more. And really, to check immunity, you need to check the cells that can make more antibodies to that particular invader. We talked about this designing experiments. Antibodies are easy to check. Cells that make those particular antibodies, very difficult to check for, much more expensive. Researchers didn't have the resources to do that. They didn't check for that. They went, oh, the antibody levels are dropped. We're not sure you're immune. But when they have gone and checked the particular cells, the CD4 cells and the T cells that make those, that activate and feed those antibodies back out, those don't seem to be depleting in people that have recovered. So there's a very good chance that immunity is maybe not lasting for 10 years, but it's lasting for a while. Although the people that reacted to COVID, the SARS-1, that was the last bad coronavirus, 17 years later, they still have a fully activated immune response to this. They've got the right cells, they've got the right antibodies, low levels, but the antibodies keep you from a return engagement with that particular invader, if the invader can be fought properly. Some invaders, and I'll talk about this later, some invaders can change their antigens. Some invaders do it through mutation. That's how HIV gets ahead of your immune response. And some of them hide the antigens they can't change and change the antigens they can change. So by the time you've made antibodies, they don't attach to the invader anymore because it's different. Either the antibodies are not the things that are stable, or they've changed it. Your ecosystem, if you're an invader, if you're a disease organism, your ecosystem has an expiration date. Sometimes sooner, sometimes later. It's going to die. You're going to reproduce, build up a population of offspring. In order to be successful, some of them have got to get to another host. And that is a hugely important part of the disease system. A number of years ago, there was a bird flu that was in commercial, like poultry. And there was a strain that could get into people and make them pretty sick. But that particular strain was not capable of passing from one person to the next person. The viruses that were emerging either weren't being passed properly, or weren't being picked up, or weren't able to reproduce at sufficient levels in the next host. They couldn't pass from human to human. So except for people getting sick, poultry farmers getting sick, it wasn't really a potentially dangerous human disease. Everybody was afraid there was going to be a strain that was capable of moving person to person. And there was one emergence of a strain in Malaysia in a small village that was fairly isolated, and there was evidence of it moving person to person, but that strain kind of died out fairly quickly for whatever reason. So it never became a widespread human influenza. Movement to another host is not a simple thing. And very often the symptoms of the disease are not just competition for resources, or the effects of a metabolite, or interactions with the host, or the host's defenses against the invader. It's things that the invader activates that are defensive, but they don't work against the invader. When you get a cold or you get the flu, you cough and sneeze. That doesn't help you. You can't dislodge these things from your cells, coughing and sneezing. What you do is you move bacterial spores or viruses and respiratory droplets onto the next potential host. When you have Ebola and you bleed from various orifices, all of those fluids are contagious for people that come in contact with them. It's not, it's just the way that it works. But when you're new as an invasive organism, you're probably not that compatible for the resources. You're not that compatible in your interactions. You may make them really, really sick, and you may kill them very, very easily. You're not getting your offspring to the next host if you're killing your new host too fast. Or you're making them so sick that they don't interact with other hosts in a way that can move your offspring. So there is a rule about new diseases that they tend to lose their nastiness pretty quickly. Because remember, the disease organisms, there's billions and billions of them. So there's a quick evolutionary process and something that turns over generations really fast. Remember, rate of evolution connected to generational length. So very, very typically, you will find a drop in nastiness in a disease as it kind of settles in. The strains that can keep their hosts up and moving around and coming in contact with other hosts have a huge benefit. The ones that don't kill them very quickly have a huge benefit. And you do see some exceptions, but most of the time, what they call the virulence will drop and drop and drop and drop and drop and drop. And then you hit a point where you're so nice to the host that you're not really producing the symptoms that spread effectively. So then the better competitors are a little bit nastier and produce a little bit nastier symptoms in order to facilitate their spread. So that you don't, in most cases, completely lose any virulence at all. But that does happen in some things, like some of the Epstein-Barr viruses just pass so easily from person to person. You don't even know that you've got most of them. Even mononucleosis, Epstein-Barr, most people carry that their whole lives and never, ever show symptoms from it. But it does pass very easily from person to person. So they don't need to be virulent in order to do that. Okay, we're going to come back and talk about a specific type of disease evolution for the next section.